Cyprus, the counterintelligence podcast, hosted by IXN Solutions, the company you turn to for corporate counterintelligence expertise and creators of 351X.
And we're live. Ryan Rambo, good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Jeremy. Here we are again. Another episode.
Oh, man, I'm excited.
I am too. This is going to be a good one. So, yeah, I did a little bit of research on our guest and did a little research on his podcast, and I think it laid it out pretty good. And I can't remember exactly the verbiage it used, but you'll probably correct me because I'm going to get it wrong. And so our guest has a podcast, and it's fantastic. It's just starting out, but it's wonderful. So I said, hey, AI, could you tell us the difference? And it said they're more of like a strategic policy focus, whereas CI Press is more tactical, on the ground, functional type thing. But the two merged together, fantastic. Jeremy, I know I dorked that up completely, man. Can you help me with the language? What do you remember? What exactly it said?
I don't know, but that's got to be close, though. I listened to the first episode within Common Ground and listening to the TikTok piece on it. That was fantastic. What a great explanation of what is happening in our world right now and how counterintelligence strategy can be applied to that. So I really enjoy the Common Ground podcast, and I can't wait till it starts to kick off a couple more episodes because I'm hanging on it. I'm waiting on it. I'm like, Shane, come on, let's get another episode published. Let's do this. Yeah, I'm excited because I think that what we're doing with Cyprus and Common Ground, they complement each other, right? We're talking like kind of down in the dirt weeds of counterintelligence. And what we often probably haven't highlighted, Ryan, is what's happening at that bigger echelon, that higher atmosphere, and how do they play off each other? So I'm really excited to dig into our conversation with Shane McNeil this afternoon. And so, Shane, go ahead, Ryan.
No, I am too. I can't wait for this conversation. I've been waiting. It's been on the calendar for a few weeks now, and every day I'm counting down the days for this. So this is going to be a good one. Probably going to be way smarter than what we normally do, you, Jeremy, but it'll be a lot of fun. And Shane is a rock star. So Shane, welcome to the CI Press podcast.
Hey, Jeremy, Ryan, I'm really excited to be here. Excited to have this conversation. You know that I love talking about CI, where it is, where it's going. I can't wait to get into this with you guys.
Yeah, it was probably a couple weeks ago, Shane, we first connected through LinkedIn, and we were talking just about counterintelligence, where it was, where it's gone, and where it needs to evolve to in the future state, and your job and everything playing factor that, and your involvement in the academic community. I found that conversation amazing, and I truly appreciate you coming on board to, educate our audience out there, and probably educate quite a bit, Ryan and I.
Hey, I'm happy to be here. Like I said, and I've been getting a lot more into the nerdy side of CI recently. Like you guys, I'm an old Army CI guy. Spent my days running around the desert. Now I sit behind a desk at the Pentagon and sit behind a desk in a classroom. So, don't get to interact the way I used to anymore. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation with some of the people that were on my in my history. So it'll be a good time.
Yeah. And you know what's funny is before our initial conversation, Jeremy, there was an article that was shared within our group, within IXN Solutions, within our team. And they're like, oh, you need to read this article. And so I did, and I was blown away by it. Now I'm planting a seed because I'm sure we're going to talk about that article later on in the episode. But that really set the hook. And then just a few days later, we're being introduced to the author. I was like, oh my God, this is awesome. So Shane, it is truly, truly an honor to have you on the show. But you spoke a little bit about your background, and we always like to start off with getting your background and telling your story. You don't get an opportunity to do that as much as you probably should. So this is it, man. We want to know how it all started and how you got to where you're at now.
It started a long, long time ago. This thing called 9/11 happened. I think that, a lot of your listeners probably remember that. And like a lot of people, I joined the Army, joined as a combat engineer, blew a bunch of stuff up, got blown up, a handful of times. And then, I was going through a readiness thing one time, and this guy's like, "Hey, you want to check out this cool thing called counterintelligence?" I was like, "Yeah, sure, let's give it a shot." Spent a few years in Army counterintelligence, back and forth to Iraq, and like we all did, running sources and all that fun stuff. And got out of that. Went to work for Defense Intelligence Agency, and kind of hung on there for a long time. Taught for a few years for any of your CI guys that have been to JCETA, Joint Counterintelligence Training Activity. That tends to be when I get recognized. That's in our community. It tends to be from the 5 years I spent there teaching, and then did a couple of deployments again, and now I'm at the Pentagon. Currently, I'm the counterintelligence policy advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Do boring things like writing doctrine and strategies, and giving my opinion on war plans and stuff like that for whatever that's worth. And this is where I throw in the required. This is everything I'm going to say for the next little while is my opinion, and going into more of my academic side, because I do got to make sure I divide that line of everything from this point out is Shane's opinion, but on the academic side. So I've been I've a background, master's degree in forensic psychology, and another master's certificate in public policy. And currently, I'm doing my doctorate in national security and statecraft at the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C., an amazing school. Some of the best instructors you ever met, and at the school, there are several of us that come from a CI background, and we started this organization called the Sentinel Research Society, to look at, we're all former CI, or most of us are current CI guys actually, but we're all doctoral students. And, we realized that we were running into problems, getting certain problems fixed, that we can't necessarily hit them from a badge of credentials side. Things like our last Common Ground episode was about that threats to academia, and the fact that academics don't really like it when a dude with a badge shows up and says, "Hey, I'm going to talk to you about the bad guys." So we're looking at things like from an academic side, and using our academic credentials of being doctoral students, almost doctors, right on the edge, and being able to have those conversations and say, like, look, from an educated academic standpoint of we understand where you're coming from. Let's have this conversation, and how do we fix those using non-governmental solutions. So that's kind of where I'm at now. We run a podcast, Common Ground, that you guys mentioned. We do some research. We have a couple of journals and a magazine that we run on Substack. I was blanking on the name for a second, but anyway, so lots of little random things here and there that we kind of do to get the message out, and kind of get CI out from being the trench coat and the trench coat and fedora kind of a picture to hey, look, we're just people trying to protect the country, and yeah, there's stuff that's secret, but there's plenty that's not, and let's have a conversation about it. And because realistically, national security affects everybody, and there can be some aspect to it that anybody can have a part in. So,
boy, Shane, thank you for that introduction. So first of all, thank you for your years of service and dedication to our nation and protecting us. All the way from combat engineer to counterintelligence. I love that. That's fantastic. When I look back at my career, I often think about the individuals that are involved in counterintelligence. The ones that I often find that were a cut above the rest are the ones with a kind of a combat background, whether it's being from the MP. We had a guest on that was that. Another one was a commo rigger, but just being outside of counterintelligence, truly have an appreciation for the Army before you kind of take off into this profession. So that's pretty awesome that you're a combat engineer. And then down at JCETA, I taught down there, Shane, and I think we probably met when we were down there around the same time. And I find that funny as well. A student will come up to you. You don't realize the impact you make on some students at the time. But I had to put it in context. I'm like, you look familiar. Give me a frame of reference, especially after years, right?
Yeah, I joke with the ones that I run into these days that I don't recognize, and I tell them, it's not a bad thing if I don't recognize you because there are the one or two that I run into, and I will remember them because they were really outstanding. But for the most part, if I remember you from your time as a student, it's because you did something wrong. And so if I've forgotten you, it means it's not a bad thing if I forgot you because it means you didn't mess up really bad in a way
That's
that was
right.
bad enough for me to remember.
That's right. I think I'm the same way. If I recall a student, it's probably because they did something that wasn't the brightest.
Yeah.
So
Well, Shane,
Shane, I have
oh,
to. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
no, I was just going to say, starting out after 9/11, you go to the Army, you go to the Army recruiter. Did you ever envision yourself and your career unfolding the way that it has over the course of 23 years? Now, I'm tapping into your psychology background to see if mentally you foresaw this thing.
I don't think anybody would have foreseen where I showed up where I'm at today. 2001, I was little skateboard kid with barely passing my first year of college, and you know basically just wanted to party and play soccer and skateboard and hang out with my friends, and wasn't a great student back then. Nobody back then would have said, hey, this guy is going to someday be a doctor and work as an advisor at the Pentagon. And, you know, I didn't foresee it. And I don't think anybody that you ever met would have foreseen it if they'd have known that version of me.
Oh,
So,
that's great. And here you are. You've cut your teeth. You've executed the craft of counterintelligence's various platforms. You've understood policy. And now, here you are, Shane. You're going to assist the Joint Staff with writing policy. I'm excited about that. But before we get to that, would you mind just talking about, in your opinion, put your academic hat on, just the kind of the current state of counterintelligence?
yeah, we've had this conversation in the past, and I know a lot of people have. Right now, counterintelligence is dealing with the, I'm going to call it fallout of 20 years of GWAT. And what we kind of got pigeonholed into from the global war on terror. And granted, the definition of counterintelligence has the word terrorism in it, and that is an aspect of the counterintelligence mission. But it was designed to be the intelligence part of counterintelligence of terrorism. When you looked at that from that angle, it should have been that yes, major groups like Al Qaeda have an intelligence collection capability, and so sure, CI has a niche in there, right? But 20 years of GWAT, we kind of got pigeonholed into, what most of us did, which was, running force protection source operations. And, you're talking to some bazaar worker, or you're talking to some goat farmer who maybe knows about a guy who shoots rockets, or, things that are basically a combination of a security mission and a traditional tactical human mission. And that was just kind of where we got left. And the problem is that those wars went on for so long that we have an entire cadre of CI professionals who are excellent at their job, but for 20 years they were trained that that's their job. And they have a lot of experience doing that, and no one over 20 years of their entire career has told them, hey, look, this wasn't what we did back in the Cold War days. This is what you did when it needed to be done because it was essential to have this capability in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. But in the Cold War days of spy versus spy, counterintelligence versus the KGB kind of a thing. That wasn't the CI mission. We weren't doing a force protection mission back then. We weren't, you know, and that's in my vision now of what's going on with CI and the current state of CI. That's where we're at right now, is an entire group of people who I don't want to say they've lost their way or that it's their, because that kind of implies it's their fault. And I was one of them. We were all one of them. I was out there running, running my sources in Iraq just like everybody else was, doing what I was trained to do and what you guys were trained to do. And it was an important mission. We kept people alive, but it wasn't really counterintelligence. And the problem is now we are looking at shifting to fighting a equivalent, a peer adversary, pacing threat, however we want to say it. And we don't have a cadre of counterintelligence professionals that have ever done that. And we have to look at how do we make that transition across basically, our workforce, our training, our everything about how we've done everything for 20 years to get people over to say, hey, look, let's go find a bunch of old guys who've got way too much gray in their beard and ask them how they did things, because we're not the experts anymore.
Yeah, it's a very true statement. And I would argue that it actually started to take place before 9/11. As we were coming out of Bosnia, you started to see generals like Eric Shinseki and others who had this great Bosnia experience and, looked at counterintelligence as something other than what it was designed to be. And whenever I came out of the schoolhouse, CISAC in 2000, I was immediately sent to a CAV squadron placed inside a CAV troop to be an embedded humaner. And I knew that we had gone sideways whenever I had just spent, 5 months learning how to do counterintelligence. But then I was thrown into a human billet. And during the entire course, that I was there, and every, time somebody would bring it up, is like, oh, you CI human guys. And it was such a misnomer, but they bundled us together because we both talked to people. And that was the only thing, that was a common thread between these two disciplines. And they're like, oh, you guys talk to people, so you're CI human guys, two totally different disciplines. And as a matter of fact, Jeremy and I just released a podcast yesterday trying to clearly define the delineation between CI and human, CI and SIGINT, CI and IMINT, to just say that counterintelligence is its own discipline. Now, funny enough, I have, a daughter who's now a CI special agent, and guess what they call her 25 years later? CI human person.
Yeah.
So it's still being done today. So I'm glad to see that we're recognizing that we have a problem, and we need to get back to, 1980s counterintelligence efforts.
Yeah. One of the conversations I wind up having way more than I thought I would is the fact that counterintelligence is not a foreign intelligence function, right? And that we are counterintelligence, right? And you've got your foreign intelligence functions: human, SIGINT, MASINT, IMINT, GEOINT, and then you've got our job, and like you just said, because we talk to people, we're put together. But realistically, only one of the missions of countering intelligence in the counterintelligence field is that counter-human piece of it. And that is a big mission, and it's an essential mission. And it's probably the one that looks coolest in TV, but that's realistically only one small piece of the job. One of the things in academia that we talk about a lot is the way, when you're talking about statecraft and, national strategy and national security policy, an important concept is, how do our adversaries, decision makers, come to the decision to, how do they decide to go to war, right? That's an essential thing, is how do you make the decision to take military action, to move from competition to crisis to armed conflict. And one of the things that, any student of history will tell you is, it is extremely rare for a nation state to decide to move into armed conflict based on human. That when a nation state says we are going to go to war, there are the handful of times we all went to Iraq. We've seen the decisions based on humans and the flaws for making decisions based on humans. But for the most part, the two things that nation state leaders want to see is imagery and SIGINT. And even going back, it was they want to read your mail, they want to get letter intercepts, they want to get cable intercepts, they want to and they want to see pictures, they want to see sketches, they want to see maps, they want to see they want to see something and they want to hear something, and that is how nations have historically decided to go to war. And in the Department of Defense, especially, we really have two jobs: to prevent the next war and to prepare to win it. And on the CI side of that, we still have a piece of that. We are supposed to be participating in that aspect of prevent a war and win a war. And from that prevent a war piece, if we're going to have an effect on the adversary's decision in war fighting, you have to look at historically what is most likely to have a significant effect. And it's not the counter-human piece, it's the counter-SIGINT and the counter-GEOINT piece, because that's what history tells us is what actually matters. And that's where we, in the CI world, can make our bones, can get our, can have our effect. Now, not that we're going to stop the counter-human piece, because on top of it being important, it's also the most fun piece. But but we do have to pay attention to the rest of that, and that's talking about the current state versus where we need to go in the future. I think that's an essential piece right there. Is that we have paid way too much attention to the counter-human piece, which has in effect pigeonholed us in with the humaniters, because it looks like we only do that one thing.
Yeah, that's spot on, Shane. Can I echo a couple of things and pick your brain on a couple?
Yeah.
So the first one being, I love that you said counterintelligence is not just counter-human intelligence, it's counter pick a discipline intelligence. And I think, as we transition from the Cold War over through GWAT, when the Cold War ended, the wall fell, that had got lost somewhere, rolling up into Bosnia, then rolling up post 9/11 in Afghanistan and Iraq. And it was strictly counter-human. And I believe those graybeards out there, when they were working the Cold War, they were doing counter-IMIT, they were doing counter-SIGINT. This is a skill set that's lost. And boy, I'm hopeful that the department will get back at it. But you mentioned a couple other things too, right? And one being is, I think that the Department of Defense has recognized that it is lacking in the counterintelligence field. And I think it starts with a couple documents. The first one being the National Defense Strategy. That says the homeland is no longer a sanctuary. If we look at where we're currently at with counterintelligence, our focus was strictly on the Middle East. We forgot about the homeland. The adversary didn't stop collecting. They didn't stop infiltrating us, whether it's in academia all the way up through the defense industry base into our government, probably the Pentagon. They didn't stop collecting. We just turned a blind eye. That's going to cripple us. And I look at the next layer down to the Department of Defense CI strategy 2021 through 2031. There's a statement in there that clearly defines where we need to be. The force needs to be trained and prepared to recognize appropriately to countering the foreign intelligence threat that's targeting us and influencing us right now. I take that to mean we're not prepared. And the department in the strategy says we need to get there. And I think it'll be incumbent upon the individuals out there that have no experience pre 9/11 and actual doing pick a military intelligence discipline, or just pick an intelligence discipline out there. They're going to have to swallow their pride a little bit and say, we don't really understand counterintelligence other than counter-humans.
Yeah. And one of the words I want to touch on that you just said is the word influence. Malign influence is a foreign intelligence activity, right? It is one of the primary things that we are seeing the adversaries use their intelligence services for in the United States. Most of it is not a human thing, but it's having a massive effect on our country right now. I mean, you can pick, go any day and look at the stories in the news and see what's going on in this country, and the effect that our adversaries have had by driving division, driving anger and divisiveness, and through their malign their malign influence efforts. And the problem is that we don't think about those things as an intelligence activity, right? And so we don't use this CI apparatus that we have of professionals who could be doing something about it. And that's, and part of that is because it's a technical thing. It's not a human thing. It's a human thing as far as the cognitive domain, but it's not a human thing as far as the person actually doing it. And so we don't tend to think about that as something that CI needs to do something about. That's one of the biggest threats we're encountering, and it's fundamentally a CI problem that we need to be getting after.
Well, and I agree with you. And we see that a lot in the political realm, but it's also very effective in the corporate world as well. I mean, that malign influence, that negative press drives down stock prices. It has an impact on markets. I mean, and so it has a whole of society impact on the way that our country runs. And I don't know that we're spending enough time, taking a look at that as well. And I always like to go back. We had a conversation with a graybeard last week that we talked about balance. We have to be able to balance all of these different threats and risks. We have a limited amount of resources, a finite amount of counterintelligence resources, and be able to balance, and give enough attention to every aspect of the threat risk that our country is facing. It's a real challenge.
Yeah, talking about corporations, you've got the dime fill methodology, and two of those letters, and you got economics, you got finance. Those are things that that the adversary is targeting that are fundamental to our success, and they're fundamental to them negating, because that's where a lot of our strength is. The United States' strength is realistically in our innovation, and innovation is tied to the economic, or the industrial sector, the corporate sector. If you look back in history, why were we successful a lot of times when even allies were struggling? It's because the United States can innovate, and can our industrial base can ramp up. We can do things in this country that no other country can, and it's because of the ability of our government and our industry and our corporations and our innovators to churn out a solution, and ra- recognize, or build a product, or create a tool, or that no other country would have come up with, and they can do it quickly. They can do it, and that is what countries like China and countries like Russia see. They're not, they're not dumb. They see why we are able to do things, and they're going to target, they're going to target what it is that will get them the biggest effect. There's a great book called Kill Chain, and it talks about this exact topic of how do you get to the solution that you're trying to accomplish. And in the United States, we tend to think in terms of platforms. We think about, we need to build the next, we had an F-22, and the next thing you build is an F-35. We got the next tank, the next ship, the next satellite, the next but you got an adversary like China that is behind, and they've got to catch up. And so they look at things from the concept of, okay, I need to be able to do that. I have to be able to stop the United States from doing blank, or I need to get ahead of them in this area, or I need to. And instead of looking at the next platform the way that we do, they look at what's the best way to accomplish that goal. And that's the topic of this book. And it's a great way to look at this, because it's exactly this is that they are going to not come at things from the way that we would look at them, but come at them from the way of the easiest solution. And a lot of times that solution is not something that we would have thought about. It's not, I'm going to send a spy. It's not, I'm going to, have a traditional military solution, or I'm going to have a traditional intelligence solution, or, even a traditional financial solution. It's that they're going to come up with the best way to achieve it without the restrictions that we place on ourselves. And then we try to mirror image and say, well, this is how I'm going to counter it. Well, yeah, that would work if we were looking at the 1980s Russians. but it doesn't work against against an adversary that will come at things from a way that we never would perceive to come at them.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, Shane. I mentioned a couple of things that I'd like to highlight as well. Innovation. I agree. The U.S. strength is in its innovation. And for the military, that starts with the defense industry base. And, we spend a lot of money on research, technology, and innovating new ideas, whether it's the Humvees to the NRAPs, or, a better fighting machine, a better fighting weapon, night vision. It all happens. True innovation happens there for our soldiers to get out there. I find it curious that you would kind of mention that the adversary, I think you kind of said or hinted at, spend more money on trying to steal that information than developing it themselves. Is that fair?
Yeah, honestly, it's not a dumb way to do it. If you look at hypersonics, and because especially in the United States, because we do care so much about that bottom line, and while we are still a nation of innovators, we're also a lot more cautious than we used to be. Hypersonics are a great example where at one time we were investing in it and then it didn't succeed the way that you thought it was going to be. So we kind of put it in the back burner and we said, oh, this isn't going to work. We're not going to be able to get this done. It's not going to be cost effective to continue with this research and development. And then, so the adversary, China steps in and says, okay, well, I'm going to steal that. And you've shown me all of the things that didn't work. So now I get to skip that whole process of figuring out what doesn't work. And I just get to jump to the solution that does work because you've shown me 1,000 ways not to do it. So now I can churn out a hypersonic weapon without having to do all of that work to get me there. Thank you for spending all of that money doing research and development that now I don't have to. And by the way, now I've got hypersonic weapons. Oh, and now because China's got hypersonic weapons, all of a sudden the United States has to jump on it and say, oh, well, okay, now we've got to get hypersonic weapons. Now we got to throw a bunch more money into this, and it's an interesting way to handle it. And yeah, stealing it is a great way for the adversary to skip that whole process. We lose our intellectual property and we spend insane amounts of money on research and development that doesn't go anywhere. And then instead of us being ahead of the game, now we're just playing catch up with our R&D. Because we don't invest in counterintelligence from the outset. When we're doing R&D, when we're doing development, when we're doing innovation, we don't invest in that counterintelligence platform to go along with that. And because of that, now instead of innovating, we're maintaining basically, and we're just trying to maintain par with the adversary instead of being ahead because we don't have that CI from the outset. We actually at Sentinel Research, we just recently sent a policy recommendation memorandum over to the Senate and House Intelligence and Armed Services committees that said exactly that when we do research and development and we start new programs, that our recommendation was that a big part of that was that you need to have funding for counterintelligence as part of that from the outset, because if not, we're giving the adversary the tools before we can even get them.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things that I've seen throughout conflict, just, not as a professor or a doctor student or anything, but just a common guy, watching the way things unfold, it always seems to be the underdog is the most innovative. Whenever they can't beat you head on, they know that. And so you see in Iraq, the explosively formed penetrators that were devastating to U.S. forces. And then you look into Ukraine and you see drone technology where, they have the first person drones that are flying out with grenades strapped to them, doing devastating damage to the Russian forces. So you always start to see this innovation start at the lowest level from an adversarial standpoint. And it makes us react to it, makes the big, strong militaries and countries out there react to it in a strange way. Do you see a counterintelligence aspect to, modern warfare and the way that it evolves on the battlefield?
Absolutely. Talking about what you just mentioned, I think back to my combat engineer days of trying to find IEDs in Iraq. And we would spend, $1 billion developing a technology to defeat, the IEDs, and they would defeat us with the timer off a broken washing machine. You know, because it's their ability to come up with something that will defeat our billion-dollar technology, is astounding. And you're right, it is the little guy that comes up with that because he's got to figure out a way to fight the adversary. And realistically, looking at CI in warfare, I think this is what you were talking about earlier. Is the article we wrote recently about counterintelligence as a joint fires function. It is exactly that. That counterintelligence has a critical role in having non-kinetic effects against the adversary. That's what we are intended to do. And if we look back to the World War II days of the OSS and X2, the old CI guys, of the OSS, they were a fundamental part of the war fighting. OSS. A lot of people think of OSS as the predecessor to our modern CIA, but realistically, OSS worked for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They were a military organization. This was old school military intelligence getting after the adversary as a fundamental part of the warfighting mission, and counterintelligence was essential to that mission. And we need to get back to that. We need to think about, CI has been pigeonholed into the whole 2x construct of, and talking about this as a 2x guy, but luckily, my bosses know my opinion on this, and I'm not secretive about it, but that the 2x construct of us, that the CI human thing that we keep talking about. Um, we have pigeonholed ourselves into number one, that we are purely an intelligence function. You got EO 12333. Counterintelligence is the EO intel function. It is. There is a massive part of counterintelligence that does an intelligence mission. There's also a massive part of CI that does that law enforcement mission. As you guys know, there's a reason that we have badges. But there's also a third piece that we need to realize and that we have forgotten, which is the counterintelligence warfighting function from the early Cold War days, the OSS days, where we need to be better integrated with the J3, with the military operations. We need to be looking at the fact that the adversary uses their intelligence platforms, their intelligence capabilities, just like we do, to support their warfighters. And that if we want to have mission success in the military, that we need to be thinking about counterintelligence as a critical part of that warfighting mission to enable the other fires elements to execute their operations without the adversary's intelligence capabilities being able to degrade that before the mission even kicks off. So, it is fundamental to warfighting. It is fundamental to military operations, and it is definitely a direction that we have got to take this in if we want to succeed.
It's funny. What's old is new again. I look back in history and we can predict what's going to happen just based on history. So what's old is new again. And, Shane, I want to pick your brain on this, right? So counterintelligence is a phase zero operation. It sets the conditions for success in shaping and protecting. I think, and I agree with you, that's where counterintelligence needs to be. We're pretty good at intel. We're pretty good at the law enforcement piece, rolling up real spies. But you're right, that CI to the warfighter function, that's been lost. That's a lost skill set.
It has, and one of the problems that we're encountering, if for anybody familiar with joint planning, is that phase zero is not even really a thing anymore. Once we came up with this concept of global competition, the phase zero concept of warfighting kind of petered out a little bit, and that basically now in that competition continuum, we roll from competition to crisis to conflict. Um, but counterintelligence is fighting its war in what would be the phase zero back in the day, what is now the competition realm. And realistically, we're effectively in a Cold War, and a Cold War is a counterintelligence war. If we look back to the old days of fighting the Russians in the Cold War, there was two major aspects of it. There was the logistics and acquisitions piece, which is a huge part of how we won that war. Was we were able to acquire, develop, and maintain our a military force that the adversary couldn't compete with. But on the other side of that was the fight between our counterintelligence services and the KGB and the SVR, and that's what a Cold War is. If we look today, we are in a Cold War again. China has been very open about the fact that they see this as a war against us. There was the book Unrestricted Warfare that they put out back in the late '90s, early 2000s, that outlined their path to fighting a war against the United States without us recognizing it's a war. And then they proceeded not just to write the book on it, but to put it into play. There's a retired general, Robert Spalding, wrote a book, War Without Rules, where he interpreted Unrestricted Warfare. Because if anybody's read it, it's very hard to read. It's not an easy book to get through, even translated into English, because it's got some of the Mandarin slang and phrasing and concepts that don't really translate into English well. It's difficult for any American to read it. General Spalding did an absolutely amazing job taking that book and interpreting it for today's DoD audience and today's political and strategic audience, and saying, hey, look, this is what they said, and this is what that means for you. And basically what he tells us is that we are currently in a Cold War, and the China tells it's amazing that there's that old saying, when somebody tells you who they are, listen to them. Well, China has told us that they are our enemy and that they are fighting a war against us, and we have forgotten about it. We're not listening to it. But on the CI side, we have to listen, because we are in that what would have been phase zero, but that war with China. There is an ongoing intelligence war with China right now, and probably a logistics war as well. And that is a Cold War, and we have to get that mentality back and understand that that's where we're at right now, and that we can't kick the ball down the road. That CI needs to get in the fight.
Well, what's sad is, and you see this both in government politics, you see it in corporate as well, is that it usually takes an incident. If we take a look back at history, and we always say that there's reflections of history in present day, it always takes an incident. It takes an attack on Pearl Harbor. It takes the building of the wall in Berlin. It takes 9/11. It usually takes us an incident, a major incident, for us to identify and realize, like, oh my God, we're in trouble, and I think our adversaries have been really smart in the way that they've played it and not had that big incident to drive the whole of society to change and turn against an adversary. And so how do we go from, being in a totally reactive state all the time, and have been within the last 100 years, to a more proactive stance from a counterintelligence perspective, to start protecting our interests before that incident happens, before left a boom, is what everybody would like to say. How do we get there?
Honestly, I think, podcasts like this one right here are a great way to start that, because, when you say it takes an incident, I think we've got plenty of those. We've got the illegal police stations in New York City that China was holding. We can go back, 15 years, I think, roughly, to look at when, Chinese hackers hacked the AP and said that the White House was under attack and crashed the stock market briefly. You can look at the Thousand Talents program that stole an entire generation of our intellectual property and our academics. We could look at TikTok and and what it has done to the psychology of American youth. And you've got the TikTok ticks. You've got increased suicidal rates. You've got increased depression. You've got decreased cognitive capabilities from, I mean, and honestly, we might be at a point where it's not that we're going to have a thing, because we're inundated with these things to the point that we can't point to one and say, that's our Pearl Harbor, that's our 9/11 from a counterintelligence standpoint, because we're seeing these on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And each one of them is bigger and more impactful than the one before. But when you constantly get hit with them, how do the American people not just see that this is how the world is, right? It didn't used to be this way, and it's not supposed to be this way. But this is where we are, and we need this type of conversation. And the fact that this is on things like Spotify, where anybody can sit and listen to it, and they can say, "Wait a minute, you're right. This is not what the world used to be." And yeah, there was 10 different, intelligence versions of Pearl Harbor and the problem is that it's not, when we talk about Pearl Harbor, we talk about 9/11, those are kinetic attacks. And we don't want to get to that point, right? If we've gotten to the point that thousands of Americans are dying, we have fundamentally failed the American people. We need to get people to recognize that there have been an abundance of that level of attacks without people dying, and that we need to take that and say, look, here is an overabundance of things that the adversary has done to us that are on par with what anybody in history would have called an act of war. And we need to act on these things before that kinetic attack happens, before Americans have to die for us to take that next step.
Yeah, 20 years of China just influencing us unbeknownst to our society. I think if you culminate all these cognitive attacks that are happening, boy, it would be enlightening. And I agree with you, Shane. So we understand we're under attack. The adversary didn't stop. They're continuing to get after us. And I hope we're about to turn that corner so we can protect our equity and our freedom. What do you think, based on that, Shane, is the future state of counterintelligence? We know the adversaries here, they're dug in. They didn't stop for 20 years while we were off in the Middle East. Where do we go?
This is where I'm going to be a little cautious as with my professional role, because I very much have things that I do on a daily basis at work that are trying to solve this problem. I can reassure your listeners that there are some of us at the Pentagon that are working on a daily basis to make this better. But from the standpoint of those of us who don't work in the Pentagon, putting my academic hat back on and talking to you guys with your company, we start pushing this in these environments, right? And so understanding that the government is going to work on this piece of it, but it's not a governmental solution in total. I think about, if we remember back to post 9/11 and the early days of counterterrorism back then. I mean, not the early days of counterterrorism, but the early days of post 9/11 counterterrorism. We looked at counterterrorism as a whole of society effort, right? All of a sudden, everywhere on the street, you saw the "see something, say something" signs, right? You saw there was reminders everywhere to the American people saying, "Hey, look, terrorism is a problem. You need to be part of that solution." We looked to businesses, we looked to religion, we looked to education, we looked at all of these different aspects of society to say, how do we fix this problem? And we realistically, even though it seems like that terrorism is still a problem, if we look at what has happened in Europe, and we look at in other countries around the globe that have had larger problems with terrorism over the last 20 years than we have, because we haven't had that many attacks compared to what other countries have. That has worked. There has been a positive effect from that. Um, I think that efforts like this are where we go to providing that narrative of, we, in Sentinel, we are looking at it from that academic side. You guys are looking at it from that corporate, that industrial side. But that's exactly how we go forward with this. Is we say, you know what, the government's got their piece of it, but those of us who have the ability to hit another piece, we have to do our part too, to bring it into that whole of society, that Cold War mentality that we just don't fundamentally have anymore. Those of us who, I mean, I'm sure we're all old enough to remember, the later days of the old Cold War, when every bad guy in every movie was a Russian. And any American kid, when they're playing army, they were always fighting the Russians, and they knew that the KGB was the bad guy. And you had Boris and Natasha, and you had um, we had that concept back then that there was something going on, and that we as Americans needed to come together to get behind that. Um, I think efforts like this, and the fact that we can have these conversations in a way that just a couple of years ago we were probably a little bit hesitant to have. We were probably we all grew up in a society of a counterintelligence society, where we were afraid to talk about stuff because you weren't supposed to talk about counterintelligence, right? It's that spooky thing that the guys with the beards do in that room over there, but we don't we pretend that they're not there. But us being able to have this conversation, I think, is how we proceed. This is how CI moves forward, is coming out of the shadows and saying, hey, Americans, there's a problem, and we're here to help you understand that problem, but it's not something you can't overcome. And if we all get together and get behind this thing, we can win. So
Yeah, you bring up a great point because I remember, I grew up in the 80s and I remember the Cold War, and the thought of doing business with the communist bloc, what nobody ever considered that, you know. But here we are, the wall has fallen, everybody's friends again in the 90s, we move into 2000s, and the thought of, oh my God, there's a 2 billion person economy over in China that we all want to get into that market, because if I sell a $1 pair of tennis shoes to 2 billion people, I'm making money. I mean, this is a great thing for me. And I think we have to come out of that mindset of that they're not just a market anymore. They're not a place where we can go and do business, but I hate to say it, but they're at war with us and they're the adversary. And we have to be realistic about our relationship and our doing business over in China, because I think we're going to find out very soon, probably within the next 20 to 25 years, that, we've been duped. And if we're talking about getting left to boom, now's the time to start doing it.
yeah, absolutely. And if we remember the old Reagan adage that that the United States is that shiny light on the hill, that there was a big thing. We need to remember what that meant. What was what made us that shining light on the hill, and that is the fundamental difference between us and a country like China. Is we have a standard for right and wrong. We have things that, while we are far from perfect, the United States is not a perfect nation by any means. We still have a moral stance that the average American can get behind. And maybe that's a big part of this counterintelligence mission, because counterintelligence is countering everything, including malign influence. Like, to circle back a little bit, and to say, hey, look, there are things that we won't stand for, and yeah, maybe we do want to make a buck, but we are not going to stand for the genocide of the Uyghurs. We are not going to stand for the censorship of the internet. We are not going to stand for the mistreatment of an entire society of people. We're, and that there are things that we fundamentally believe in, and this is what America is, and we are going to be that shining light, and we're going to stand up and say right is right and wrong is wrong. And that's our message to the world. And it's funny because nine times out of 10, somebody will tell you that's not a counterintelligence job, but it has a counterintelligence effect, right? And that's what it's about. It's about having that effect, and us standing up and saying we're going to be the good guys, and they're going to be the bad guys. And part of being a good guy is standing up for what is right, and by doing that, we're going to defeat or we're going to defeat the Russians. We're going to defeat the Chinese. We're going to defeat the Ministry of State Security. That wouldn't have been a hard thing to say, back in the 80s. To say that the KGB was the bad guys in the 80s would not have been a hard thing to say. But today, if you say that same thing, you say the Ministry of State Security is the bad guys, people are hesitant, and we need to be able to draw that line much more clearly and say, yeah, and that allows us to have that counterintelligence effect. So,
Well, and I would like to go back to something you said post 9/11, and you said, there were slogans, see something, say something. It was a whole of society approach, but what also went along with that was an outreach. We did a coordinated outreach program to our Muslim community. We started to meet them in common ground. We started to build relationships, and I think the same can be done. So we're not going to demonize the people within the United States. We have Chinese, first generation Americans and visa holders and students and all of that stuff. But I think it would benefit us from a counterintelligence standpoint to do an outreach, to say, hey, look, man, here we are. We're the counterintelligence professionals. We know what you're up against whenever it comes to, coercion and what your country can do to you. But we're the people that you talk to remedy these issues. I think it goes a long way, and we can take those lessons that we learned from post 9/11 and utilize it to further the counterintelligence mission.
absolutely. And talking about that outreach, a big part of that, if we remember back to how many times have we watched a China espionage investigation just fall apart because we tried to keep it too secret, that we tried to maintain, and rightfully so, there are things that need to stay classified. um, but we don't communicate well with the American people. We have tried to keep counterintelligence behind a curtain, and by doing that, when we do things like come out with a an espionage investigation, that, granted, there is going to be classified stuff. We're not going to be able to put everything out there. But when we don't put everything out there, and the American people are not currently in a place where they're inclined to believe everything we say, um, they believe that we are doing things for a prejudiced reason. If you guys remember that 60 Minutes episode, several years ago, where there was and I apologize, I'm blanking on the case, but there was the Chinese espionage case that failed. And realistically, when you looked at the case, it looked like the FBI was conducting that investigation because the guy was Chinese. Based on what was out there in the public, it looked like racism. It realistically did. Even as a CI agent, when I watched that 60 Minutes episode, and I tried to be objective about it, and I listened to the evidence they're presenting, I'm like, yeah, that looks like racism, you know. And that's fundamentally a problem, because the American people aren't in a place where they trust us, because we've been behind, our CI guys have been behind this curtain, and so we look like the spooky guys that are out to get you, and then we do something that looks racist, and why should anybody believe that it's not? I know a lot of the FBI agents that were part of that investigation. They're all good guys. They were doing a great job. None of them were doing it because of any nefarious reasons. That was a good case. It just didn't turn out well. But the American people don't know that. And if we would be more out there with it, we would be more upfront, and we would say, hey, look, here is this outreach to the community, and we are trying to have these conversations, and we are trying to be upfront with everybody and show the American people this is what's going on in the world. then when cases like that come up, and maybe we have to put a little bit of stuff behind the curtain, and we have to say, hey, look, you're going to have to trust us a little bit that this guy's a spy. We've bought that trust in advance to be able to do that.
Right, we had turned a blind eye in 2010 with that 60 Minutes interview, and just kind of reframing where counterintelligence to be focused, because we're in the Middle East. I want to go back, not go back, probably go forward from 2010 just by 2 years, and that's October 2012. There's a presidential debate happening between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. And there's a very famous quote in there, and I don't want to get political, but I just want to pull this quote out. And Barack told Mitt Romney, because Mitt Romney's focus was the geopolitical foe being Russia. And Barack quipped back, the 1980s called, and they're asking for your foreign policy back because the Cold War's been over for 20 years. That is not accurate.
Yeah,
just because we turned a blind eye.
No, you're totally right. And it's funny because there's a couple of different ways to look at that. Obama was also one of the earlier presidents to do the what wound up not being an awesome pivot to Asia, but there was technically a pivot to Asia at the time. I don't know that we actually pivoted at all because we were still very focused on the Middle East.
We were.
But realistically, there was, if you look at it from that angle, then that Cold War was over. But we were just moving into another Cold War. The Russians have continued messing with us. They have continued being a thorn in our side. They haven't gone away by any means. But I do think the more immediate threat to the United States is definitely China. If we have to look at who's going to have a more immediate impact on the lives of the American people, China has that ability. That if you think about why do we go to war, to get back into my put my academic hat on of why we go to war from a historical and strategic standpoint, there are certain things you go to war for, and there are certain things you don't. And protecting the lives, the economic stability, the foundational aspects of life in America is something that maybe you would go to war for. The only one who's able to affect that kind of stuff is China. But then Russia very much has its impacts in the globe, and as we move into it, not move into, as we are in a global economy, we do have to very much take that into account as well. So there's a lot of different ways that we can look at that, and I think it's funny because when we talk about we don't want to be political, it's that honestly you kind of do have to be, because politicians always look at things from one side or the other, and realistically the truth is always somewhere in the middle, and usually there's a little bit of truth on both sides of those things. And those of us work in the government, that work in counterintelligence, we have to be able to say, yeah, that's right, and that's right, and there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance there, and I can believe two contrary things at the same time. So
yeah, I think China is definitely the pacing threat, and we need to focus on the Indo-PACOM AOR. You think of just about what happened here recently with, like you said earlier, the police departments that the Chinese had created here in the U.S. They're rolling up people here in Houston and in New York. That's wild to me. And even in the news, they arrested another Chinese spy, and this is 2 times now, right next to the mayor in New York. They're here, they're active. I don't think we can forget about the Russians, though, because look at just their activities. The Anna Chapman in 2010, the illegal, they're still employing these tactics, and we are in a Cold War. And I'd like to echo one more thing before I ask you my final question. I love the see something, say something. It goes back to training. It goes back to kind of getting out there and telling society what the threat is. And now that they're trained, they need to know how to report, though. Just because you see something, how do you say something to somebody? It's going to be an all society approach to look at protecting the U.S. through counterintelligence apertures.
Yeah, that is a great question, because if you're the average American and you see something that you think is malign influence, you see something that you think is Chinese intelligence activity or Russian intelligence activity, but it's not I think if somebody saw somebody they thought was a spy, they'd be like, "Yeah, I call the FBI about that," right? I mean, yeah, that's. I think any American can understand. Okay, if I see a spy, I need to call the FBI. But when you see something on TikTok or you see something on on the news or in whatever it is that you encounter in your daily life, and you say, "Hey, look, this is probably something nefarious," who do you contact? Right? Is the is the FBI the place that they're gonna take every call from every because I mean, we remember our field office days when you've got people calling with every possible there was always the lady who would call and she had some kind of crazy rant every week or something, and you don't want to create a situation where now the FBI is taking a call from everybody who sees a Chinese person behind a tree, right? um but we do need a way that somebody can report that, and I don't know that we have an effective mechanism at the moment. I don't know what the answer is on that one. I think that's very much uh, it's a gap. It's definitely there's a shortfall there, but I don't know that we have an immediate solution at this point. And it may be something that we need to look at. You know, does the government work with the social media companies to create a mechanism where Americans can look at something and say, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't smell right, and they report it, because that's where the average American encounters this on a daily basis, is on social media.
Right.
I don't know, that might be a solution.
I would offer up maybe, Shane, something that maybe a different approach. Report it to a police department, but police departments need to understand what a counterintelligence incident is rather
Yeah.
than burdening the bureau offices, right? Can they be that first line of defense? Everybody, for the most part, knows their community service or their police officer. That's going to go into educating the force out there at the police departments to get them to understand what counterintelligence is. Ryan's ready.
I'm ready. And Shane, you've brought this up so many times, and I love it because you're speaking my language. And just you've called it a Cold War. And you know that history, again, reflections, it speaks to modern day. So whenever we took a look at the Cold War between us and the Soviet Union, there were several competitions that were happening across the board. We had an arms race, as who's going to build the latest technology. Well, we see that with us in China today. We see it in the sports world, where we're competing head to head in competitions like Olympics and other things. We see it in science and technology. Who's going to advance faster? We see that in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. We see it in the space industry. Who's going to get to the moon first? Who's going to get to Mars first? All of these benchmarks are being met today between us and China. So wherever you say it's a Cold War, even though we don't have the proxy war angle of this, where we're fighting over boundaries and buffer zones and that sort of thing, everything else that you've mentioned is absolutely correct. I mean, we are in a Cold War. These things are happening today, and it's time for us to recognize it as a society. Would you agree with some of that concept?
I would absolutely agree with it. And with the proxy war aspect of it, I don't see that as a necessary part of it. Just because it was part of the last Cold War doesn't mean that it's a fundamental part, because it's about the achievement of a goal, right? And if a war is fought to achieve an objective, right? And if you don't have to have any kinetic effects to achieve that objective, then why would you? Right? That should always, I mean, even, when we think about this from a military standpoint, in the United States, for us, armed conflict is the last thing that we want to do. If we can achieve a military objective without firing a shot, then we do. That's the first goal of the US military. So why wouldn't we recognize that the adversary can do that same thing, and that they can achieve their objective without firing a shot, and without them, getting somebody else to fire a shot? There doesn't have to be a proxy war for it to be a Cold War. if they're able to achieve every one of their goals without having to use any type of kinetic force. They are having non-kinetic effects on a daily basis, and we are looking for that kinetic effect for it to before we're willing to say that it's a war.
Well, Shane, we're a little over time. We try to keep it at an hour, but man, what a fascinating conversation. We could pick your brain all day. I'm very confident this won't be the last time that we have this conversation or a conversation like it. But man, you've got my wheel spinning because you keep bringing the parallels to a Cold War, and it all fits. And I agree with you. We need a whole of society approach. Maybe it's cartoons again, Saturday morning at 6 o'clock that, starts waking up the kids and saying, hey, look, here's the bad guy. We need to be attention to it, or a TikTok video, whatever it takes. But we have to do things like this to raise awareness. I'll kick it over to Jeremy. Jeremy, I know you have some final questions and thoughts.
No, Shane, thank you. I appreciate the time this afternoon. I would like to close on this, though. What are your final thoughts and your recommendations for our audience out there?
One of the things you just mentioned, the cartoons. I think back to Superman defeated the KKK. Rocky and Bullwinkle were used to defeat the Russians. Maybe we do need something like that. But the American people need to be aware. I think that's the key, and that's what both of our organizations are working towards, is that awareness. We're hitting different sides of it, but we are both trying to work towards that common goal of getting the American people to recognize that there is a counterintelligence threat out there, and that it's something that the average American needs to see. It's not just something that the guys in Washington need to pay attention to. We need our businesses in Middle America and down in Texas where you guys are at to open their eyes and say we're in a Cold War, that our nation is at risk, and we need to get together behind this type of thing. And I am so excited to be a part of this effort. I would love to have, if you guys want to have me back, I would absolutely love to come back and talk to your audience again. I've had a really good time having this conversation. I enjoy being nerdy about this kind of stuff. So, anytime you want to nerd out about counterintelligence topics, I am here.
Oh, we're going to book you, Shane. That's happening. Speaking of your counterintelligence, or speaking of your podcast, Common Ground, if our audience wanted to reach out to you or kind of listen to that, how could they reach out to you, and where can they listen?
So our website is sentinel-research.com. And that's, if you want to find us on there. But if you want to get the podcast, we are available on Substack, on Spotify, and on Apple Podcasts. On Spotify, on Substack, also, we have a magazine that we publish on there. All of the articles are written by grad students and interns at the Institute of World Politics. On our website, we publish a biannual journal of research related to counterintelligence and different topics of academic interest from a CI standpoint. You can always find us on podcast at sentinel-research.com if you want to contact our podcast team. And other than that, we're happy to have anybody hit us up and give us suggestions for things that they want to hear an episode about. So,
Shane, thank you again for the time. This has been a fascinating conversation, informative, and you know what? I'm glad you're at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, setting the future for counterintelligence to protect the nation out there. Thank you in advance for the hard work that you're doing. Thank you for giving back through the academic community. And again, thank you for taking the time this afternoon.
Hey, Jeremy, Ryan, I appreciate it, and I'm happy to be here. I look forward to the next time we get to do this.
Well, Shane, I really had a great time. I hope you enjoy going back and hanging out with the other CI human people. And just joking. If we could break that bond, it'd be fantastic. But thank you again, Jeremy. Another great episode. I hope our audience enjoys it, and we look forward to the feedback.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks for giving us a listen out there. Hey, check out our website, www.ixnsolutions.com. If you have a topic you want Ryan or I to discuss, please reach out. if you want to be a guest, better yet, let's get you on board to talk about whatever it is you want to talk about and related to counterintelligence. But Ryan, fascinating conversation. I'm looking forward to getting Shane back on board here in the future. And over to you, brother.
Yeah, me too. And again, we always try to end on this note. If you see something, say something. If it makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, it's probably not right. Trust your gut. If you have a security type incident, please reach out to security professionals, make them aware of it so they can take action on it. And with that, until the next time, thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.